Sometimes a child's greatest act of courage comes from simply wanting a place to belong. When 10-year-old Addie Mae spent her last $5 on an old cabin, she thought she was buying herself a future away from the prying eyes of her small Wyoming town. The year was 1894, and orphaned children like Addie had to grow up fast or risk being swept aside by a world that had little patience for the lost. She pushed open the cabin door, expecting dust and cobwebs. Instead, she found another girl hiding in the corner, thin and scared, who wouldn't speak a single word. This stranger looked like she hadn't eaten in days, and her clothes were nothing but rags. Addie knew right then that her simple dream of a quiet life had just become something much more complicated. What was this mysterious girl running from? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sound of her grandfather's blacksmith hammer had been the rhythm of Addie Mae's life for as long as she could remember. Each morning she woke to the steady ring of iron against iron, the sound echoing through the small room above the forge where she'd lived since her parents died in the influenza outbreak of 1889. That hammer, worn smooth by decades of faithful work, represented everything. She knew about family, about persistence, about making something useful from raw metal and determination. Samuel Hartwell had been the town's blacksmith for 37 years, and at 68, his shoulders still carried the strength needed to shoe horses and mend wagon wheels. But Addie could see the weariness settling into his bones, the way he paused longer between strikes, the careful way he moved when he thought she wasn't watching. She understood, without being told, that their time together was borrowed, that she needed to prepare for a future where she might have to stand on her own. The town of Cedar Ridge, Wyoming, sat in a valley between rolling hills that turned golden in autumn and bone white in winter. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where whispers followed orphaned children like shadows, and where a 10-year-old girl with no parents was either pitied or ignored, neither of which suited Addie's proud spirit. You're getting to be of an age where folks will start asking questions, her grandfather had told her just last month, his weathered hands gentle as he braided her long brown hair. Questions about your schooling, about who's going to look after you proper when I'm too old to swing this hammer. Addie had pressed her face against his flannel shirt, breathing in the familiar sense of coal smoke and honest sweat. I can look after myself, Grandpa. You taught me how. I taught you to be strong, little bird. But strength and stubbornness ain't always the same thing. The conversation had planted a seed of worry that grew into determination. Addie began saving every penny she earned, helping the local women with their washing. Every nickel she made gathering eggs from Mrs. Henderson's difficult hens. Every dime her grandfather slipped her for keeping the forge tidy. The $5 had taken her 8 months to accumulate, and she'd hidden them in a tin box beneath a loose floorboard in her room. The abandoned cabin she'd heard about sat 2 miles outside town, on the edge of where civilization gave way to wilderness. It had belonged to a family named Morrison, who'd packed up and left after 2 harsh winters broke their spirits. The land agent, Mr. Cornelius Blake, was a thin man with calculating eyes who seemed perpetually annoyed by the troubles of poor folks. $5, he'd said when Addie approached him with her offer. Child, that cabin ain't worth the nails holding it together. But I suppose it's better than letting it rot completely. The transaction had felt momentous to Addie, her first real act of independence, her first step toward controlling her own destiny. She'd walked the 2 miles to the cabin with her belongings tied in a small bundle, 2 dresses, a pair of winter boots her grandfather had made, her mother's Bible, and a photograph of her parents on their wedding day. The cabin was smaller than she'd remembered from glimpsing it during trips to gather firewood. Grey-weathered boards, a stone chimney that leaned slightly to one side, and windows so dirty they barely let in light. But it was hers, the first thing she'd ever truly owned, which made finding another girl inside all the more shocking. Now, 3 days after that discovery, Addie sat in the kitchen behind her grandfather's forge, stirring a pot of stew and trying to decide what to do. She'd managed to keep her secret so far, telling her grandfather she'd been helping Mrs. Thompson with her garden when he asked about her absences. The lie sat uncomfortably in her stomach, but she couldn't shake the memory of the terror in the other girl's eyes. "You're mighty quiet tonight," Samuel observed, settling his aching bones into his favorite chair. "Something troubling you?" Addie studied her grandfather's face, the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into forge fires, the silver beard he kept neatly trimmed, the hands that could shape iron but had always been gentle with her. If she couldn't trust him, who could she trust? "Grandpa, if you found someone who was scared and hungry, but they couldn't tell you why they were scared, what would you do?" Samuel's weathered features creased into a thoughtful expression. "Well, now that's a question with some weight to it. I suppose I'd start by making sure they were safe and fed. Fear has a way of making everything else harder to sort through. But what if helping them might bring trouble?" "Addie Mae," her grandfather said, leaning forward with the serious expression he wore when imparting important lessons. "Trouble has a way of finding us, whether we go looking for it or not. But turning away from someone in need, that's the kind of trouble that follows a person for the rest of their days." That evening, Addie walked the familiar path to Lorna Brennan's house on the other side of town. Mrs. Brennan was a widow of 63 who'd lost her husband in a mining accident 5 years prior. And like many of the town's women, Lorna didn't treat Addie like a charity case or speak to her in the high, careful voice people used with damaged things. Lorna's house was neat and small, with a vegetable garden that produced more food than one woman could eat, and a front porch where she often sat in the evenings, watching the world with eyes that seemed to see more than most people revealed. She'd been a friend to Addie's grandmother, and after the older woman passed, she'd quietly stepped into the role of confidant and occasional source of practical wisdom. "Well, hello there, Miss Addie," Lorna said as she opened her door to the evening's knock. "You look like you've got something heavy on your mind." Lorna's kitchen was warm and welcoming, filled with the scents of baking bread and dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. She poured Addie a cup of milk and settled across from her at the scrubbed wooden table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "Now then," Lorna said, her voice gentle but direct, "what's got you looking like you're carrying the weight of the world on those young shoulders?" Addie took a deep breath and told her everything. About buying the cabin, about finding the girl, about the fear in those young eyes, and the way the stranger seemed to shrink from any loud sound or sudden movement. Lorna listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. When Addie finished, the older woman sat quietly for several moments, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "This girl," Lorna finally said, "did she seem hurt? Injured in any way? Not hurt like broken bones or cuts, but hurt in a deeper way, if you understand me." "I do understand." "And you say she hasn't spoken at all?" "Not a word. Just stares at me like she's trying to figure out if I'm going to hurt her." Lorna's expression grew thoughtful. "There have been some troubling things happening around these parts lately. Families picking up and leaving sudden-like, claims that their land wasn't worth staying for. But some of us older folks, we remember when this valley was full of promise, when families came here to build something lasting." She rose from the table and moved to her window, gazing out at the darkening sky. "Your instincts to help this child are good ones, Addie. But if she's running from something serious, we need to be careful about how we proceed. What do you think I should do?" "Keep doing what you're doing. Make sure she's fed and feels safe. But don't try to force her to talk. When a person's been through something terrible, sometimes silence is the only protection they have left. The words will come when she's ready." Lorna turned back to face Addie, her expression serious but kind. "And tomorrow I think I'll take a walk out that direction. Maybe bring some of my herb tea and a warm blanket. Sometimes it helps when there's more than one person showing kindness." As Addie walked home through the gathering dusk, she felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. Having Lorna's support made the burden feel more manageable, less like a secret she had to carry alone. The sound of her grandfather's hammer had stopped for the day, but she could see the warm glow of lamplight in their kitchen window, a beacon calling her home to safety and love. Tomorrow, she would return to the cabin with food and reassurance. Tomorrow, she would try once more to coax the mysterious girl from her shell of fear. And with Lorna's help, maybe she could begin to understand what had driven a child to seek shelter in an abandoned cabin and why she seemed so terrified of being found. The $5 had bought her more than just a cabin, Addie realized. They'd bought her a purpose, a responsibility, and perhaps, if she was brave enough and patient enough, a friend who needed her as much as she needed to be needed. The next morning arrived with the crisp promise of autumn in the air. Addie packed a basket with leftover stew, fresh bread, and a jar of milk, along with one of her own winter dresses that might fit the mysterious girl. As she walked the familiar path to the cabin, her heart hammered against her ribs with anticipation and worry. She found the girl exactly where she'd left her, huddled in the corner of the cabin's main room, wrapped in the thin blanket Addie had brought the day before. At the sound of the creaking door, the girl's head snapped up, her wide eyes immediately searching for escape routes, even as she recognized Addie. "It's just me," Addie said softly, setting the basket down slowly and remaining near the doorway. "I brought you some food and a warmer dress." The girl watched every movement with the intensity of a wild animal. But Addie noticed something different this morning. Instead of pressing herself deeper into the corner, the girl remained still, alert but not actively trying to hide. Progress. Addie settled herself on the floor, several feet away, and began unpacking the basket, narrating her actions in a calm voice. "This is beef stew from last night's supper. My grandfather makes it with carrots and potatoes from Mrs. Henderson's garden. And here's some fresh bread, still warm from the oven." She placed each item between them, creating a small feast on the dusty cabin floor. The girl's eyes followed every movement, and Addie could hear her stomach growling from across the room. "You don't have to be afraid of me," Addie continued, breaking off a piece of bread and taking a bite to show it was safe. "I live here now too. Well, not here exactly, but this is my cabin. I bought it with my savings." The girl's expression shifted slightly, curiosity flickering alongside the ever-present caution. "My name is Adelaide, but everyone calls me Addie. What's your name?" Silence stretched between them, broken only by the girl's ragged breathing and the distant sound of wind through the pine trees outside. Addie waited, then tried a different approach. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. But if you're hungry, the food is here whenever you're ready." She stood slowly and moved toward the window, giving the girl space. From this vantage point, she could see the path that led back to town and the wilderness beyond. As she gazed out at the landscape, she heard the soft sounds of movement behind her, careful, hesitant footsteps across the wooden floor. When Addie turned back, she found the girl kneeling beside the food, her thin fingers wrapped around the piece of bread. She was eating with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days, but her eyes never left Addie's face. "That's good," Addie said gently. "There's plenty more where that came from." As the girl ate, Addie noticed details she'd missed in yesterday's shock and dim light. The stranger appeared to be about her own age, with tangled brown hair that might have been pretty when clean and neat. Her dress was indeed little more than rags, torn, stained, and far too thin for the approaching cold weather. But it was her hands that caught Addie's attention, small and delicate like her own, but marked with scratches and calluses that spoke of hard work and harder living. Most telling of all was a small tear in the fabric near the girl's shoulder, revealing a flash of blue underneath, a piece of better cloth. As if she'd been wearing something nicer before circumstances reduced her to these rags. "Where did you come from?" Addie asked, settling back down on the floor but maintaining her distance. "These mountains can be dangerous for someone traveling alone." The girl's eating slowed, and she glanced toward the door with that familiar expression of trapped fear. "It's all right," Addie said quickly. "You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to go. But if someone hurt you, if someone's looking for you, well, maybe I can help." The girl's hands trembled as she set down the bread. For a moment, Addie thought she might speak, might break the silence that surrounded her like armor. Instead, the girl reached into the folds of her tattered dress and pulled out something small and blue. It was a piece of fabric, fine cotton or maybe even silk, torn roughly, as if ripped away in haste or violence. The color was a deep, rich blue that spoke of quality and care, nothing like the rough homespun most frontier families wore for everyday use. The girl held the fabric toward Addie, her eyes desperate with the need to communicate something important. When Addie reached out to take it, the girl pulled it back, pressing it to her chest with both hands. "That's yours," Addie said, understanding. "Something important to you?" The girl nodded, the first clear response she'd given to any of Addie's words or questions. "Did it come from a dress? Something pretty you used to wear?" Another nod, this one accompanied by tears that began sliding down the girl's dirty cheeks. "Someone took it away from you." This time, the nod was accompanied by a sound, a small, broken whimper that contained more anguish than any scream could have conveyed. Addie felt her own eyes fill with tears. Whatever had happened to this girl, it had been terrible enough to strip away not just her voice, but her sense of safety in the world. The torn piece of blue fabric represented more than just a lost dress. It was evidence of a life interrupted, a childhood torn away. "I'm sorry," Addie whispered. "I'm so sorry that happened to you." The sound of approaching footsteps outside caused both girls to freeze. The mysterious girl's face went white with terror, and she scrambled toward the far corner of the cabin, clutching the blue fabric against her chest. "Addie!" came Lorna's familiar voice from outside. "Are you in there, dear?" Relief flooded through Addie, even as she saw the panic in the other girl's eyes. "It's all right," she said quickly. "That's Mrs. Brennan. She's a friend. She wants to help." But the girl was shaking her head frantically, pressing herself against the wall as if she could disappear into the logs themselves. "She's safe," Addie insisted, moving slowly toward the cowering figure. "She's the kindest person in town. She won't hurt you, and she won't tell anyone you're here if you don't want her to. Addie." Lorna's voice came again, closer now. "Just a minute, Mrs. Brennan," Addie called back, then knelt beside the frightened girl. "Listen to me. Yesterday you were all alone and scared. Today you have me. Tomorrow, with Mrs. Brennan's help, maybe you'll feel a little safer. But the choice is yours. If you want to stay hidden, I'll ask her to leave." The girl stared into Addie's eyes, searching for something. Honesty, perhaps, or strength, or simply the promise that she wouldn't be abandoned to face whatever she was running from alone. Finally, she gave the smallest of nods. "Mrs. Brennan," Addie called, "you can come in now. But please move slowly and speak softly. She's very frightened." The door opened with a gentle creak and Lorna stepped inside, carrying a basket of her own. She took in the scene with one comprehensive glance. The frightened girl in the corner, the evidence of shared food, the careful distance Addie maintained to avoid seeming threatening. "Well, hello there, sweetheart," Lorna said in the same gentle voice she used for injured birds and skittish horses. "My name is Lorna. Addie told me you might be in need of some help." The girl's eyes darted between Addie and Lorna, measuring, calculating, trying to determine if this new adult represented safety or danger. "I brought some warm clothes and a bit of medicine," Lorna continued, settling her basket on the floor near Addie's. "Nothing you have to take if you don't want it. But if you're feeling poorly, it might help." She pulled a small brown bottle from her basket, along with a thick wool cloak and a pair of sturdy shoes. "These belonged to my daughter when she was about your age. She's grown now with babies of her own, but I kept some of her things thinking they might be useful someday." The mention of family seemed to cause the girl physical pain. Her grip tightened on the blue fabric, and fresh tears began flowing down her cheeks. Lorna and Addie exchanged a meaningful look. Whatever this child had lost, it was more than just material possessions. The blue fabric in her hands might be the only remaining piece of the life she'd known before. Whatever terrible event had driven her to seek shelter in an abandoned cabin. As the sun began to set outside the cabin windows, Three unlikely companions sat in thoughtful silence, an orphaned girl seeking independence, a widow offering wisdom and compassion, and a mysterious child holding tightly to a scrap of blue fabric that represented everything she'd lost, and perhaps, with help and patience, everything she might still hope to find again. Over the following days, a careful routine developed around the abandoned cabin. Each morning, Addie would arrive with food and fresh water, often accompanied by Lorna, who brought practical supplies and a calming presence that seemed to gradually ease the mysterious girl's constant state of alertness. The girl, who still hadn't spoken her name, began to show small signs of trust. She would eat in their presence now, and sometimes even moved closer to the warmth of the small fire Lorna had shown Addie how to build safely in the stone fireplace. But she never let go of that piece of blue fabric, keeping it clutched in her hand or pressed against her chest like a talisman. It was on the fourth day that Lorna noticed something that would change everything. "Addie," she said quietly, nodding toward the girl who sat near the window, gazing out at the pine trees. "Look at her neck." Addie squinted in the dim light filtering through the dirty glass, and there, barely visible beneath the tangled hair and grime, was a thin cord. As the girl shifted position, a small object caught the light. A wooden cross carved with delicate precision and worn smooth by handling. "That's beautiful craftsmanship," Lorna murmured. "Not the kind of thing made by just anyone. Someone skilled carved that. Someone who cared enough to make it special." The observation sparked a memory in Addie's mind. "Mrs. Brennan, didn't the Hartwell family used to live out near Copper Creek? They had a reputation for fine woodworking." "The Hartwells, yes." Lorna's expression grew troubled. "But they left sudden-like about 6 months ago. Packed up in the middle of the night, people said. Left their land and everything. Left or were driven away." The question came from the girl herself, so softly that both women almost missed it. Addie and Lorna turned in stunned silence toward the corner where the girl sat, her eyes wide, as if she couldn't believe the words had escaped her lips. "Did you just—" Addie began. "You spoke," Lorna said gently. "That's wonderful, dear. What was your question about the Hartwells?" The girl's hand flew to her throat, touching the wooden cross through the fabric of her tattered dress. Her mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to whisper, "They didn't leave." They couldn't leave. The words hung in the air, like a challenge to everything the town believed about the Hartwell family's sudden departure. Addie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the cabin's walls. "What do you mean they couldn't leave?" Lorna asked, her voice carefully neutral. The girl's eyes darted between them, fear and desperation warring in her expression. "Papa carved this," she whispered, touching the cross again. "He made it for me when Mama got sick. Said it would keep me safe when he couldn't." Addie's breath caught in her throat. "You're a Hartwell." A single nod, followed by fresh tears streaming down the girl's dirt-stained cheeks. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Lorna asked. Clara Hartwell." The name seemed to unlock something in the girl. Clara, and words began tumbling out in a broken whisper. "Papa said we had to be careful. Said there were men who wanted our land, wanted to take it away from families like us. But he also said we had rights, that we couldn't be forced to sell." She pulled the piece of blue fabric from her dress and held it out toward them. "This was from my Sunday dress. Mama made it for my birthday. We were going to wear our finest clothes to church that morning, and afterward, Papa was going to file papers in town. Official papers that would make our claim stronger." Addie and Lorna exchanged glances. Land disputes were common enough on the frontier, but something in Clara's tone suggested this was more serious than the usual arguments over boundary lines and water rights. "What happened that Sunday morning?" Lorna asked gently. Clara's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Men came. 3 of them, maybe 4. I was gathering eggs when I heard shouting. Papa told me to hide in the root cellar, said no matter what I heard, I wasn't to come out until everything was quiet." Her small hands twisted the blue fabric into knots. "I waited and waited. When I finally came out, they were gone. All of them. Papa, Mama, even our dog. The house was all torn up and there was—" She stopped abruptly, her face going white. "There was what, Clara?" Addie asked softly. Blood on the kitchen floor. And Papa's papers were gone, all of them. The implications of Clara's story settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. If what she was saying was true, the Hartwell family hadn't left voluntarily. They'd been murdered, and their land claims had been stolen to cover up the crime. Lorna's face had gone grim. How long ago did this happen? 6 months, maybe more. I lost track of the days, and you've been living out here alone all this time. Clara nodded. At first I stayed near the homestead, thinking they might come back. But then I realized if those men found out I was still alive, if they knew I saw what happened, they'd come for you too, Addie finished. The cabin was empty, and it was far enough from town that nobody would think to look here. I've been careful, only going out at night to find food, staying hidden during the day. Lorna stood and began pacing the small room, her mind clearly working through the implications of Clara's story. Child, this is more serious than a simple land dispute. If men killed your parents and stole their claim, they won't hesitate to harm anyone who threatens to expose them, which means Clara isn't safe here anymore, Addie said, understanding dawning on her face. If they're still around, if they're still taking land from other families, they are. Clara's voice was flat with certainty. I've seen them. At night, when I thought it was safe to move around. They wear badges, act like they have authority. But they're the same men who came to our house that Sunday morning. The wooden cross around Clara's neck seemed to catch the light as she spoke, a reminder of her father's promise to keep her safe. But even the most faithful protection could only do so much against men who were willing to kill for land and profit. We need to be very careful about our next steps, Lorna said finally. If these men are still operating in the area, if they're using official positions to cover their crimes, then going to the wrong person for help could put us all in danger. Addie felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. By buying this cabin, by finding Clara, by choosing to help instead of walking away, she'd stepped into something much larger and more dangerous than a simple act of kindness. But looking at Clara, seeing the way she clutched her father's cross and her mother's fabric, the only remaining pieces of the family she'd lost, Addie knew she couldn't abandon her now. The $5 silver that had seemed like such a significant sacrifice now felt like the smallest price imaginable for the chance to help someone who'd lost everything. Clara, she said firmly, you're not alone anymore. Whatever happens next, whatever we decide to do, you have us now. We're going to figure out how to keep you safe and make sure the people who hurt your family are held accountable. Clara's eyes filled with tears. But for the first time since Addie had found her, they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of relief, of hope, of finally believing that she might not have to carry her terrible secret alone anymore. The breakthrough in Clara's willingness to speak seemed to open floodgates that had been sealed by months of terror and isolation. Over the next several days, more details emerged about the morning her family was murdered and the long, frightening months that followed. They took everything, Clara told them as she sat wrapped in the warm cloak Lorna had brought. All of Papa's carefully written papers, the deed to our land, even Mama's jewelry box. But they left this. She reached into her dress and pulled out a small, faded photograph. A family portrait showing a man with kind eyes and strong hands, a woman with Clara's gentle features, and a younger version of Clara herself. Standing between her parents in front of what must have been their homestead, Addie took the photograph carefully, studying the faces of people she would never meet, but who had clearly loved their daughter deeply. They looked like good people. They were the best people, Clara whispered. Papa worked hard every day, and Mama took care of everyone, not just our family, but any neighbor who needed help. When Mrs. Patterson's baby was born too early, Mama stayed with her for 2 weeks, helping nurse the little one back to health. Lorna examined the photograph with the careful attention of someone who understood how precious such mementos could be. This must be worth more than gold to you. It's all I have left of them. Well, this, and Papa's cross, and the piece of Mama's dress. Clara's voice grew stronger as she spoke about her parents, as if their memory gave her courage. Clara, You mentioned seeing these men at night wearing badges, Addie said. Can you describe them? Would you recognize them if you saw them again? The question caused Clara to shrink back slightly, but she nodded. The leader was a big man with a grey beard and mean eyes. He wore a sheriff's star, but it looked different from the one Sheriff Morrison used to wear when he came to check on folks. Lorna and Addie exchanged worried glances. Sheriff Morrison had died of pneumonia the previous winter, and his replacement was a man named Wade Garrett, who'd come from back east with credentials that impressed the town council. What did this man's badge look like? Lorna asked carefully. Chenier, newer, and he acted like he owned everything he looked at. Clara shuddered at the memory. The other men called him boss, not sheriff. How many others were with him? Usually 2. One was thin with dark hair and a scar across his cheek. The other was younger, maybe not much older than my papa, but he looked mean even when he smiled. As Clara described the men, Addie noticed that her fear seemed to lessen with each detail she shared. It was as if speaking the truth out loud was helping her reclaim some power over the memories that had tormented her. There's something else, Clara said, her voice growing stronger. I followed them once at a distance. They went to the old Manning place. You know, the farm about 5 miles north of here. The Mannings left around the same time around the same time my parents disappeared. Lorna's face went pale. The Mannings had children too. A boy about 15 and twin girls Clara's age. What happened to them? Addie asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. The official story was that they decided farming wasn't for them, sold their land, and moved back east to live with relatives, Lorna said slowly. But Emma Manning had written to me just weeks before they supposedly left, talking about how excited she was for the harvest, how well the children were doing in their studies. Clara nodded grimly. When I got close enough to see the Manning house that night, it looked just like ours did after. Empty, but not packed up empty. Abandoned empty, like people had left in the middle of living their lives. The implications were staggering. If Clara was right, if the same men who had killed her family were responsible for other disappearances, then they were dealing with something far more serious than a single act of violence. This was a systematic campaign to steal land from homesteading families, using murder and intimidation to cover their tracks. How many families do you think have disappeared? Addie asked. Lorna was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking through the past year's events. The Hartwells, the Mannings, the Kowalski family who had that nice spread near the river, the old Norwegian couple who lived up on Sunset Ridge, all told the same story, decided farming wasn't for them. Sold out, moved on. 5 families, Clara said. Maybe more. I started keeping track after I realized what was happening. She reached into her dress again and pulled out a small piece of bark with scratch marks covering one side. I marked each time I saw them visit an empty homestead, each time I heard in town that another family had moved on. Addie counted the marks. 12. 12 families, she breathed. 12 that I know about. But I've only been watching for 6 months, and I can't get close to town very often. The scope of the conspiracy was overwhelming. Dozens of people, men, women, children, gone without a trace, their land absorbed into whatever scheme these criminals were operating. We have to tell someone, Addie said. The territorial authorities, someone in the capital who isn't part of this. Tell them what? Lorna asked practically. That a 10-year-old girl who's been living wild in the woods for 6 months has seen some men with badges. That families who officially sold their land and left were actually murdered. We have proof, Clara said quietly. At least I know where some proof might be. Both women turned to look at her. Before Papa was killed, he hid something. A strong box with all our important papers, copies of other families' claims, evidence that someone was trying to force people off their land illegally. Clara's voice grew more confident. He buried it near our old root cellar. If it's still there, if they didn't find it, it might have everything we need to prove what really happened. The possibility of concrete evidence shifted the entire dynamic of their situation. Instead of relying solely on the testimony of a traumatized child, they might have documents, official records, proof that could convince even skeptical authorities. How dangerous would it be to retrieve this strongbox? Lorna asked. Very, Clara admitted. They still patrol that area sometimes, and if they see anyone near the old homestead, they'll know someone survived. They'll know I'm still alive. Addie felt a familiar surge of determination, the same feeling that had driven her to save $5 silver and buy her independence. Then we'll have to be very careful about how we do it. We? Lorna raised an eyebrow. Clara can't go alone, and she's the only one who knows exactly where her father hid the strongbox. But she's also the most recognizable if those men see her. She needs help. Clara looked between the two women who had become her unexpected allies. For the first time since that terrible Sunday morning, she felt something stronger than fear growing in her chest. Hope maybe, or determination, or simply the relief that came from no longer being alone with her terrible secret. There's one more thing, she said quietly, about why they wanted our land specifically, why they were willing to kill for it. She stood and moved to the window, pointing toward the mountains that rose beyond the forest. Papa found something up there, in the hills behind our property. Something valuable. He was excited about it, said it would secure our future, make sure I could go to school back east if I wanted. Gold? Addie asked. Maybe, or silver. He never told me exactly. Said he wanted to file the proper claims first, make sure everything was legal before word got out. Clara's voice grew heavy with regret. I think that's what got him killed. Someone found out about the discovery, decided it was easier to kill us and steal the land than to compete for the mining rights. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just about farming land or even systematic theft. It was about mineral rights, about wealth hidden in the mountains that unscrupulous men were willing to commit murder to claim. All the more reason to find that strongbox, Lorna said grimly. If your father documented his discovery, if he has proof of his mineral claims, then we have evidence not just of murder, but of the motive behind it. As the sun began to set outside the cabin windows, 3 unlikely conspirators began planning what might be the most dangerous undertaking of their lives. Clara had survived 6 months alone through sheer will and careful hiding. Addie had learned that $5 silver could buy much more than independence. They could buy the chance to right a terrible wrong. And Lorna had discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures came not in youth, but in the wisdom of maturity, when a person finally understood what was truly worth fighting for. Tomorrow, they would begin the careful work of planning a rescue mission, not just for a buried strongbox, but for the truth itself. 3 days of careful planning had passed before Lorna made the discovery that changed everything. She'd been walking the perimeter of the cabin that morning, checking for signs that anyone had been watching their comings and goings, when something metallic caught her eye near the base of a large pine tree. A belt buckle, distinctive and ornate, partially buried under fallen leaves. She picked it up carefully, brushing away the dirt to reveal an elaborate design, an eagle with spread wings, clutching arrows in its talons. And beneath it, initials carved in flowing script, J.M., Clara, Lorna called softly as she entered the cabin where the girl was mending a tear in her dress with thread Addie had brought. Have you ever seen this before? Clara looked up from her needlework, and the blood drained from her face so quickly that Addie thought she might faint. That's his, Clara whispered. The thin one with the scar. He was wearing that buckle the morning they came to our house. Lorna turned the buckle over in her hands. J.M., those initials mean anything to you? Papa heard him called Jake something. Clara's voice was barely audible. But what's it doing here? The implications were chilling. If one of the men responsible for murdering Clara's family had been near the cabin recently enough to lose his belt buckle, it meant their hiding place might not be as secret as they'd hoped. We need to assume they know about this place, Lorna said grimly. Which means Clara isn't safe here anymore. But where can she go? Addie asked. If they're watching the town, if they have authority, my house, Lorna said without hesitation. It's not perfect, but it's better than leaving her exposed out here. Clara shook her head frantically. I can't put you in danger. If they find me with you, Child, I've been in danger since the moment I decided to help you. The only question now is whether we're going to face that danger with you, hidden and helpless, or with you, where we can protect you properly. As they discussed their options, Addie found herself thinking about the belt buckle and what its presence near the cabin might mean. Mrs. Brennan, what if this Jake person didn't lose this recently? What if it's been here since before Clara started hiding here? You think he was here before I arrived? Clara asked. It's possible. Maybe they used this cabin for meetings or storage, or just as a way station when they were working in this part of the territory. The theory made sense, and it was less immediately threatening than the idea that Clara had been discovered. But it also meant that the cabin might hold other clues about the men they were hunting. Over the next hour, the three of them searched every inch of the small building. In the gap between two loose floorboards, Addie found a scrap of paper with what looked like a crude map sketched on it. Clara discovered a small cache of supplies hidden behind a loose stone in the fireplace. Jerky, hardtack, and a bottle of whiskey. Most significantly, Lorna found something wedged under the windowsill that made all of them go quiet. A piece of official-looking paper, torn and water-stained, but still bearing a partial seal and fragments of text. The words they could make out were damning: transfer of mineral rights, and effective immediately upon, and most clearly, Sheriff W. Garrett, Territorial Authority. Wade Garrett, Lorna breathed. The new sheriff. Clara stared at the fragment of document. So he's not just working with them. He's leading them. The realization transformed their understanding of the entire situation. This wasn't a case of criminals operating despite law enforcement. It was law enforcement itself that was corrupt, using official authority to legitimize theft and murder. No wonder no one questioned the family's leaving, Addie said. If the sheriff himself was vouching for the sales, providing the paperwork, then anyone who might have been suspicious would assume everything was legal and proper. Lorna finished. Clara picked up the belt buckle, turning it over in her small hands. Jake Morrison, she said suddenly. What? Jake Morrison. I just remembered that's what the sheriff called him that morning. Jake Morrison, secure the perimeter. I was so scared I forgot, but hearing the names together brought it back. Lorna's face went pale. Morrison, any relation to our old sheriff? Could be a son, maybe a nephew, Addie suggested. Someone who felt entitled to his predecessor's position and decided to take what he thought should be his by right. The pieces were falling into place, painting a picture of corruption that went beyond simple greed. This was revenge, entitlement, and opportunity, combining into something deadly. We need that strongbox now more than ever, Lorna said. If Clara's father documented his mineral discovery, if he kept records of threats or attempts at intimidation, it might be enough to convince the territorial authorities that their appointed sheriff is a murderer. But how do we get to it? Clara asked. If they're still patrolling the area around our old homestead, we create a distraction, Addie said, an idea forming in her mind. Something that draws them away from the homestead long enough for Clara to retrieve the strongbox. What kind of distraction? Lorna asked warily. The kind that makes them think they've found something more valuable than watching an empty farm. Addie's voice grew more confident as the plan took shape. Clara, you said your father found mineral deposits in the hills behind your property. What if word got out that someone else had found something valuable in a completely different direction? Somewhere far enough away to pull their attention, but close enough to town that it would seem believable. Clara's eyes began to brighten with understanding. You want to start a false gold rush. Not a rush exactly. Just enough talk to make them think they need to investigate. Maybe check out some claim jumpers, secure some valuable territory before word spreads. Lorna was nodding slowly. It could work. Men like that, they're driven by greed. The possibility of missing out on something valuable would be like catnip to them. But it would have to be convincing, Clara warned. These aren't stupid men. Murderous and corrupt, yes, but not stupid. Then we make it convincing, Addie said with the kind of determination that had driven her to spend her last $5 silver on independence. We make it so convincing they can't afford not to investigate. As evening settled over the cabin, the three conspirators refined their plan. Clara would move to Lorna's house for safety, while Addie would begin spreading carefully crafted rumors about mineral discoveries in the hills north of town. Once they were confident that Sheriff Garrett and his men had taken the bait, Clara would return to her family's homestead to retrieve the evidence that might finally bring justice for all the families who had been murdered for their land. The fraudulent deed was worse than any of them had imagined. Lorna discovered it purely by accident, tucked between the pages of an old ledger in the town clerk's office where she'd gone to research property transfers. The document bore Sheriff Garrett's official seal and signature, transferring the Hartwell property to something called the Wyoming Territory Development Company for the sum of $50, a deep fraction of what such valuable land should have been worth. But it was the date on the deed that made Lorna's blood run cold. 2 days before Clara's family was murdered. They had already decided to kill them, she told Addie and Clara that evening in the safety of her own kitchen. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or a plan gone wrong. They forged the sale documents before they committed the murders. Clara stared at the deed with a mixture of horror and vindication. Papa always said he'd never sell our land, not for any price. Now there's proof that he didn't. There's more, Lorna said grimly. She spread out copies of several other documents on the kitchen table. I spent the afternoon going through property records. Every family that supposedly sold out and moved on has similar paperwork. Same company, same low prices, same sheriff's signature. Addie counted the documents. 14 properties. Thousands of acres. And if Clara's right about the mineral deposits, we're talking about wealth beyond anything these small homesteads could have generated through farming alone. Clara picked up one of the deeds, the one transferring the Manning property. The Mannings had 3 children, she said quietly. Twins my age and an older boy. Where do you suppose their signatures are on this document claiming they willingly sold their home? The question hung in the air unanswered, because they all knew the terrible truth. There were no signatures because there had been no willing sales. Just like Clara's family, the Mannings and all the other families had been murdered to clear the way for this massive land grab. We need to move quickly, Lorna said. If Garrett realizes someone has been looking through the property records, he'll know his operation is compromised. How quickly? Addie asked. Tomorrow. We put our distraction plan into motion tomorrow, and Clara retrieves that strongbox tomorrow night. The plan they'd developed was elegant in its simplicity. Addie would spend the day in town, carefully spreading rumors about prospectors she'd supposedly seen heading toward the hills north of Cedar Ridge. She'd mention seeing surveying equipment, talk about strangers asking questions about mineral rights, and generally create the impression that someone was about to stake valuable claims in territory that Garrett and his men hadn't yet secured. Meanwhile, Clara would use the daylight hours to study the route to her family's old homestead, planning the safest path and identifying hiding spots in case she needed to take cover quickly. I know every inch of that land, Clara assured them. Even in the dark, I can find my way to the root cellar where Papa hid the strongbox, and if you encounter Garrett's men... Lorna asked, I run, I hide. I've been doing it for 6 months. I know how to stay invisible. As they finalized their preparations, Addie noticed that Clara seemed different than she had even a few days earlier. The terrified, silent girl who'd been hiding in the abandoned cabin was still there. But she was joined now by someone stronger, someone who had found her voice and was ready to use it in service of justice. Clara, Addie said as they prepared for bed, aren't you afraid? Terrified, Clara admitted. But I'm more angry than afraid now. They killed my parents, my neighbors, children I went to school with. They stole everything and thought no one would ever know the truth. Her hands unconsciously moved to touch her father's cross at her throat. Papa always said that sometimes the right thing and the safe thing aren't the same thing. Tomorrow, I'm going to do the right thing. The next morning dawned clear and cold, perfect weather for Addie's performance in town. She made her way to Henderson's general store, where the town's gossips gathered each morning to discuss the previous day's events and speculate about their neighbor's business. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," Addie said cheerfully as she entered the store. "I was wondering if you'd heard anything about those prospectors camping up north." Mrs. Henderson's eyes immediately sharpened with interest. "Prospectors? What prospectors?" "Oh, maybe you haven't heard yet. I was helping my grandfather repair a wagon wheel for the Johnson family yesterday, and Mr. Johnson mentioned seeing some men with surveying equipment heading up toward Copper Creek. Said they looked like they knew what they were looking for." Surveying equipment. This came from Mrs. Patterson, who had been examining bolts of fabric but was now listening intently. "That's what he said. Theodolites, measuring chains, the whole outfit. Professional-looking men, too. Not the usual rough types you see wandering through looking for easy gold." Within an hour, the story had grown in the telling. By noon, according to the rumors circulating through town, a major mining operation was preparing to establish claims in the northern hills, and several prominent businessmen from back east were reportedly en route to oversee the development. Sheriff Garrett heard the rumors during his lunch at the hotel restaurant, and Addie watched from across the street as he had an intense, whispered conversation with two men who matched Clara's descriptions of his accomplices. By 3 o'clock, all three men had ridden out of town heading north, their saddlebags bulging with supplies for what appeared to be an extended scouting expedition. The bait had been taken. That evening, as darkness settled over the valley, Clara prepared for the most dangerous undertaking of her young life. She wore dark clothes that would help her blend into the shadows, and she carried only the essentials: a small knife for protection, a canvas bag for the strongbox, and her father's cross for courage. "Remember," Lorna told her as they embraced goodbye, "if anything goes wrong, if you sense any danger at all, abandon the mission. The strongbox isn't worth your life." "My family is worth my life," Clara replied. "And all the other families, too. This might be the only chance we get to prove what really happened." As Clara disappeared into the darkness, heading toward the ruins of her childhood home and the buried evidence that might finally bring justice, Addie and Lorna settled in to wait. The longest night of their lives was about to begin, and by morning, they would either have the proof they needed to expose a conspiracy of murder and theft, or they would have lost the brave girl who had become like a sister to them both. Clara returned just before dawn, exhausted and filthy but triumphant, clutching a small metal strongbox against her chest. Her hands were scratched and bleeding from digging in the dark, but her eyes blazed with vindication. "I found it," she gasped, as Lorna helped her into the warm kitchen. "Everything Papa hid is still there." The strongbox was heavier than its size suggested, secured with a simple but sturdy lock that Clara opened with a key she wore on a chain beside her father's cross. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture, were documents that would change everything they thought they knew about the conspiracy. The first item Clara pulled out was a letter, written in her father's careful handwriting and dated just 3 days before his murder. As Lorna read it aloud, the true scope of the corruption became clear. "My dear daughter," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my fears have come to pass, and the men who covet our land have succeeded in silencing me. But I pray that the evidence I leave behind will not let their crimes go unpunished." The letter went on to detail months of threats and intimidation, not just against the Hartwell family, but against dozens of homesteaders throughout the territory. But it was the final paragraphs that contained the shocking revelation. "I have discovered that the man calling himself Sheriff Wade Garrett is not who he claims to be. His real name is Wade Morrison, and he is the son of our former sheriff, Thomas Morrison. When Thomas died last winter, Wade came to claim what he believed was his birthright, not just his father's position, but control over the entire territory. He has been forging documents, bribing officials, and when those methods failed, resorting to murder." Clara's hands trembled as she held the letter. "Morrison. He's Sheriff Morrison's son. But there's more," Lorna said, continuing to read. "Listen to this. Wade Morrison has a partner in these crimes, a man from the territorial capital named Cornelius Blake, who has been facilitating the fraudulent land transfers and providing legal cover for the thefts. Blake visits our territory monthly, always staying at the hotel, always meeting with Morrison in secret. Addie felt her stomach drop. Cornelius Blake, that's the land agent who sold me the cabin. The implications hit all three of them simultaneously. Blake wasn't just facilitating the land fraud, he was directly profiting from it. Every property stolen through murder was being resold to unsuspecting buyers like Addie, creating a second layer of profit while providing additional cover for the crimes. Which means, Lorna said slowly, that your purchase of the cabin was part of their operation. They needed someone to take legal ownership of the property to make the whole scheme look legitimate. Clara rifled through the remaining contents of the strongbox and pulled out a detailed map of the territory, marked with mineral survey symbols and notes in her father's handwriting. "Papa found gold," she said, pointing to several marked locations, "not just on our property, but throughout this entire region. Look at these notes. He estimated millions of dollars in deposits across 14 different claims." 14 claims, Addie repeated. "The same number as the fraudulent deeds." "It's not a coincidence," Lorna said. Morrison and Blake identified every property with valuable mineral deposits, then systematically murdered the families to steal the land. The final item in the strongbox was perhaps the most damning, a copy of an official territorial document bearing the seal of the governor's office, appointing Wade Morrison to the position of sheriff. But this copy had handwritten notes in the margins, notes that revealed it was a forgery. "Papa must have gotten his hands on the real appointment," Clara said. "Look at the differences in the dates, the signatures, even the paper quality." As dawn broke over Cedar Ridge, the three conspirators sat surrounded by evidence of crimes that went far beyond what they had initially suspected. This wasn't just local corruption. It was a carefully orchestrated scheme involving forged official documents, systematic murder and fraud on a territorial scale. "We need to get this evidence to someone with real authority," Lorna said. "Someone above the territorial level who can't be bought or intimidated. The federal marshals," Addie suggested. "That would be ideal, but how do we contact them without Morrison realizing what we're doing?" Clara, who had been quietly studying her father's map, suddenly looked up with an expression of alarm. "We may not have as much time as we think. Look at this." She pointed to a section of the map that covered the area around town. Her father had marked several properties with dates and notes, including one that made Addie's blood run cold. S. Hartwell, forge and residence, mineral survey scheduled. "My grandfather's property," Addie whispered. "They're planning to target my grandfather's property." "When?" Lorna asked urgently. Clara searched through her father's notes until she found the relevant entry. According to this, Papa thought they would move on the blacksmith property within 6 months of acquiring the surrounding lands. "That would be now," Addie finished. "They're planning to move on Grandpa now." The realization added desperate urgency to their mission. It was no longer just about seeking justice for past crimes. It was about preventing future ones. Addie's grandfather, the only real family she had left, was next on Morrison's list. "We have to warn him," Addie said, already moving toward the door. "Wait," Lorna called. "We can't just rush back to town without a plan. If Morrison has returned from his wild goose chase, if he suspects we've been gathering evidence against him, then we spring our own trap," Clara said, her voice carrying a determination that reminded them all of how much she'd grown since that first terrified morning in the abandoned cabin. "We use the evidence to force a confrontation, but on our terms, in a place where there will be witnesses. What do you have in mind?" Addie asked. "The Harvest Festival starts tomorrow. The whole territory will be in town. Territorial officials, federal representatives, even some foreign investors looking at development opportunities. If we can present our evidence publicly, in front of witnesses who can't be silenced or bought, Morrison will have no choice but to respond," Lorna finished. And when he does, he'll either have to confess or reveal himself as the fraud he is. It was a dangerous plan, one that would put all of them at risk. But as they sat in Lorna's kitchen, surrounded by evidence of Morrison's crimes and knowing that Addie's grandfather was next on his list, they realized they had no choice. The Harvest Festival would be their battlefield, and the truth would be their weapon. By tomorrow evening, either Wade Morrison would be exposed as a murderer and thief, or the three of them would be dead. There was no middle ground left, only justice or silence, and they had already chosen which one they would fight for. The Winchester rifle had belonged to Lorna's late husband, Marshal James Brennan, who had served the territory with honor until a supposedly accidental cave-in at the copper mine ended his life 5 years earlier. As Lorna cleaned and loaded the weapon that morning, she found herself wondering if James's death had been as accidental as everyone believed. "I never thought I'd have cause to use this again," she told Addie and Clara as she checked the rifle's action. "James always said it wasn't the gun that made a person dangerous, it was the willingness to stand up for what's right when the cost might be everything." You hold dear, the Harvest Festival was set to begin at noon, with the entire territory expected to attend. Farmers and ranchers would display their best produce and livestock, merchants would hawk their wares, and families would gather for what was traditionally the most joyful celebration of the year. Under normal circumstances, it would be a day of community and thanksgiving, but these were not normal circumstances. Addie had spent the morning with her grandfather, finally telling him everything about buying the cabin, finding Clara, discovering the conspiracy, and most importantly, about the danger he now faced as Morrison's next target. Samuel Hartwell listened to his granddaughter's story with the steady attention he gave to any complex problem that required careful thought and precise action. When she finished, he was quiet for several long minutes, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "So this Morrison fellow thinks he can intimidate an old blacksmith into selling land that's been in our family for 20 years, he said finally. "And when intimidation fails, he's prepared to use the same methods he used on those other families. Grandpa, we have to be very careful. These men have killed children, and they've made a serious error in judgment if they think I'll go quietly." Samuel stood and walked to a cabinet Addie had never seen him open. From it, he withdrew a gun belt and pistol that looked well-maintained despite their age. "I may be 68 years old, but I wasn't always a blacksmith. There was a time when I wore a badge myself back before you were born." This revelation stunned Addie into silence. Her grandfather, the gentle man who had raised her, who spoke softly and worked with his hands, had been a lawman. "I served as a deputy marshal for 3 years in Kansas before I met your grandmother and decided to settle down to a quieter life. But some skills, once learned, are never entirely forgotten." He strapped on the gun belt with movements that spoke of muscle memory and long practice. "If Morrison wants a fight, he'll get one. But it will be a fair fight, which is more than he gave those other families." Meanwhile, Clara was experiencing her own transformation. The terrified girl who had hidden in an abandoned cabin was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival sometimes required courage beyond what seemed possible. "I've been thinking about what I want to say," she told Lorna as they reviewed their plans one final time. "When I stand up in front of all those people and tell them what Morrison did to my family, to all those families." "And what do you want to say?" "I want to tell them that Papa always said the truth was like iron. It might get heated and hammered, but it never breaks. It just gets stronger." Clara touched the cross at her throat, then reached into her dress and pulled out the piece of blue fabric that had been her first clue to her identity. "I want them to know that every family that disappeared was someone's whole world. They weren't just names on fraudulent deeds, they were parents and children and neighbors who deserved better." The festival began precisely at noon, with the town square filling up with families from throughout the territory. Addie positioned herself near the makeshift stage where the evening speeches were planned, keeping watch for any sign of Morrison and his men. Clara remained hidden at Lorna's house until it was time for their presentation, while Lorna moved through the crowd, quietly identifying potential allies among the territorial officials and visiting dignitaries. It was during the afternoon competitions, the pie contests and livestock, judging that formed the heart of any harvest celebration, that Addie spotted him, Sheriff Wade. Morrison stood near the hotel, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with a thin man in an expensive suit who could only be Cornelius Blake. Even at a distance, Addie could see the anger in Morrison's posture, the way his hand kept moving toward his gun. Their distraction had worked too well. Morrison and his men had spent the previous night and morning searching the northern hills for the non-existent prospectors, only to realize they'd been deceived. Now they were back in town, suspicious and dangerous. As the afternoon wore on, Addie noticed Morrison's men positioning themselves strategically around the festival grounds. Jake Morrison took a post near the stage, while the third man, whom Clara had described as young and cruel-looking, stationed himself near the main exit from the town square. They were preparing for something. At 4 o'clock, Lorna made her move. She approached the festival's organizing committee and requested permission to make a special presentation during the evening's formal program. It's a matter of territorial importance, she told Mayor Whitman, loud enough for several territorial officials to overhear. Evidence of crimes that affect the safety and security of every family in this region. The mayor, a pompous man who enjoyed being at the center of important events, readily agreed. Of course, Mrs. Brennan, we'll add you to the evening program right after the territory representative's address. Word of the mysterious presentation spread quickly through the crowd, generating exactly the kind of anticipation Lorna had hoped for. By evening, everyone would be gathered in the town square, expecting revelations that would affect the entire territory, including Sheriff Wade Morrison. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the festival grounds, the final preparations began. Samuel joined Addie near the stage, his presence reassuring despite the gravity of their situation. "Are you ready for this, little bird?" he asked, using his pet name for her. "I'm scared, Grandpa." "But I'm more ready than scared. That's all anyone can ask. Fear is just proof that what you're doing matters." Lorna appeared beside them, the Winchester rifle concealed beneath a long coat, but readily accessible if needed. "Clara's in position behind the stage. The moment I call her forward, she'll have the evidence with her and 3 territorial officials who've agreed to provide protection." "And if Morrison tries to stop her?" Addie asked. "Then we'll discover what kind of man he really is when he's forced to act in front of witnesses, instead of in the darkness where he's committed his other crimes." The crowd began, gathering around the makeshift stage as the evening program prepared to begin. Families settled on blankets, children ran between the adults playing games, and the normal sounds of community celebration filled the air. But Addie could see Morrison and his men moving closer, their hands resting on their weapons, their eyes fixed on the stage where the truth was about to be revealed. The moment of reckoning was at hand. In a few minutes, Clara would step forward and tell her. The town bell began to ring, not the cheerful peals that usually marked festival celebrations, but the slow, deliberate tolls that called the community to witness something of grave importance. Mayor Whitman had ordered it rung the moment Clara began reading her father's letter, understanding instinctively that whatever was happening on his stage would be remembered long after the harvest celebration was forgotten. Clara's voice carried across the hushed crowd as she read, "To whoever finds this letter, know that Sheriff Wade Morrison is not who he claims to be. His real name is Wade Morrison, son of our former sheriff, and he has been systematically murdering families to steal their mineral-rich land." A gasp ran through the assembled crowd. Several people turned to look at Morrison, who stood frozen in the torchlight, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "She's lying," Morrison called out, his voice harsh with desperation. "This is clearly the ravings of a disturbed child. I demand that this charade be stopped immediately." But Clara continued reading, her young voice growing stronger with each damning revelation. "I have documented 14 separate instances of families being threatened, intimidated, and when they refused to sell their land, murdered. The man calling himself Sheriff Garrett has forged territorial documents, bribed officials, and covered up his crimes using the authority of his false badge. Congressman Davies stepped forward from the crowd. "Young lady, these are very serious accusations. Do you have evidence to support these claims?" Clara nodded and reached into the strongbox, withdrawing the fraudulent deeds that Lorna had discovered. "These documents show that my family's land was officially sold 2 days before we were murdered. The same pattern exists for every family that supposedly left the territory voluntarily." Morrison made his move then, lunging toward the stage with his gun drawn. "Enough of this nonsense. I'm placing this girl under arrest for disturbing the peace and making false accusations against a territorial officer." But Samuel Hartwell stepped directly into his path, his own weapon leveled at Morrison's chest. "I don't think so, son. The girl isn't finished talking. Move aside, old man. This doesn't concern you. It concerns me plenty when armed men threaten children in my town." Samuel's voice carried the authority of his forgotten years as a deputy marshal. "Especially when those men are wearing badges they have no right to carry." The crowd had formed a rough circle around the confrontation, with Clara still on the stage holding the evidence, and the 2 armed men facing each other in the flickering torchlight. But it was what Clara did next that transformed the entire situation. She reached into her dress and pulled out her father's wooden cross, holding it high so everyone could see. "This cross was carved by my father, Thomas Hartwell, a good man who worked hard and treated his neighbors with respect. Sheriff Morrison shot him down in our kitchen while he was trying to protect my mother and me." Morrison's face went white. "That's impossible. There were no survivors." He stopped abruptly, realizing what he'd just admitted. No survivors from what? Congressman Davies asked, his voice sharp with interest. The slip had been crucial. Morrison had just confirmed that he knew about the Hartwell murders, knew there were supposed to be no witnesses to tell what really happened. Clara pressed her advantage. "There's more," she said, reaching once again into the strongbox. "My father kept detailed records of every threat, every attempt at intimidation, every family that was targeted." She withdrew a leather-bound journal and began reading entries. March 15th. Sheriff Morrison visited again today, offered half what the land is worth, became threatening when Papa refused. March 22nd. Found our fence cut, cattle scattered. Morrison's men seen in the area. April 3rd. Direct threat made against Mama and me if Papa continues to refuse their offer. With each entry, Morrison's position became more untenable. The crowd was murmuring angrily, and several men had moved closer to the stage, their own hands resting on their weapons. "Where are Morrison's men now?" Samuel asked quietly, not taking his eyes off the corrupt sheriff, but addressing his question to Addie. "Jake Morrison is near the hotel," Addie replied, scanning the crowd. "The other one was by the main road, but I don't see him now." Morrison's eyes darted around the circle of increasingly hostile faces, calculating his chances. "You people don't understand," he said desperately. "This territory needs strong leadership, needs someone willing to make hard decisions. Those families were weak, unable to develop the land properly. We were creating opportunities. You were committing murder," Clara said, her voice ringing with righteous anger. "You killed children. You killed my parents while they begged for their lives." The crowd's mood had shifted from curiosity to outrage. These were farming and ranching families who understood the value of hard work and honest dealing. The idea that their elected sheriff had been systematically murdering neighbors was beyond comprehension. Morrison raised his gun toward Clara, desperation driving him to threaten a child in front of dozens of witnesses. "Shut up, just shut up." That was the moment Samuel Hartwell had been waiting for. The moment when Morrison revealed his true nature so clearly that no one could doubt Clara's testimony. Clara reached into her dress one final time and withdrew the object that would seal Morrison's fate, her father's gold pocket watch, its surface scratched and dented, but still recognizable by its distinctive engraved inscription, "To Thomas Hartwell. With gratitude for 20 years of honest service, Cedar Ridge Town Council." "9-4. This watch belonged to my father," Clara said. holding it up so the torchlight caught the engraving. It was given to him when he completed 20 years as the town's official surveyor and mineral assessor. The morning he was killed, one of Morrison's men took it from his body. She looked directly at Morrison, her young face filled with resolve. "You want to know how I know Jake Morrison was there that day? Because he's wearing my father's watch right now." Every eye in the crowd turned toward Jake Morrison, who stood frozen near the hotel entrance. Instinctively, his hand moved toward his vest pocket, where the chain of a pocket watch was clearly visible. "Jake!" Morrison called out desperately. "Don't!" But it was too late. Jake Morrison's guilty reaction had confirmed everything. Congressman Davies stepped forward with authority. "You by the hotel. Step into the light and show us that watch." Jake Morrison looked around wildly, realizing he was trapped. The crowd had spread out to surround him, and several armed townsmen had positioned themselves to block any escape route. "I don't have to show you anything," Jake snarled. But his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, you do," said a new voice from the edge of the crowd. A tall man in a federal marshal's badge stepped forward, flanked by two deputies. "I'm Marshal William Hayes, and I've been investigating reports of territorial corruption for the past month. This young lady's testimony provides exactly the evidence we've been seeking." Morrison's face went ashen. The federal authorities were already involved, already investigating. His entire operation was collapsing around him. "The watch," Marshal Hayes said firmly, addressing Jake Morrison. "Remove it and hand it over." With trembling hands, Jake Morrison withdrew the pocket watch and held it out. Even from a distance, the engraving was clearly visible to everyone present. "Thomas Hartwell's watch," the marshal confirmed, examining the inscription. "Property of a man who was supposedly never harmed, taken from his body by men who supposedly never met him." The crowd erupted in angry voices. These were people who had known and respected Thomas Hartwell, who had benefited from his honest surveying work and fair assessments. The proof that he had been murdered and robbed by the men who were supposed to protect the community was more than they could tolerate. "String them up!" someone shouted. From the back of the crowd, "Murderers deserve to hang," called another voice, but Marshal Hayes raised his hand for silence. "There will be justice, but it will be legal justice. These men will be tried in a federal court, where all the evidence will be properly presented and judgment rendered according to law." Morrison made one last desperate play. "You can't trust the word of a child," he called out to the crowd. "She's been living wild for months, probably deranged from the experience. These so-called evidence pieces could have been planted by who?" Clara interrupted, her voice clear and strong. "By the 10-year-old girl who's been hiding in the woods, afraid for her life. Did I also forge my father's handwriting? Did I create false documents that match the territorial records? Did I somehow convince your own man to carry my father's stolen watch?" The logic was unassailable. Morrison's protest sounded increasingly hollow as Clara systematically dismantled each of his objections. Samuel Hartwell kept his gun trained on Morrison while addressing the crowd. "Folks, I've lived in this territory for 20 years. I've watched families come and go, seen good people struggle to build something lasting on this hard land. What this girl is describing, systematic murder to steal mineral rights, it explains a lot of things that never made sense before, like why so many good families suddenly decided farming wasn't for them," called out Mrs. Henderson, "like why their children never wrote letters. Home," added another voice, "like why their abandoned homesteads always seem to have left behind more than people taking a planned trip would leave," said a third. The crowd was reaching its own conclusions, connecting Clara's testimony to their own observations and suspicions. The truth was resonating because it explained mysteries that had troubled the community for months. Morrison looked around the circle of hostile faces and made a calculation. He raised his gun again, this time pointing it directly at Clara. "If I'm going to hang anyway, I might as well finish what I started." But he never got the chance to pull the trigger. Samuel Hartwell's bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying into the dirt. At the same moment, Marshal Hayes and his deputies moved in to secure Jake Morrison and search for the third member of their gang. Justice had finally come to Cedar Ridge, delivered by the courage of a 10-year-old girl who had refused to let her family's murder go unavenged. 6 months later, the new deed lay spread across Lorna's kitchen table, its official seals and signatures representing something more valuable than the land it described. The document, signed by the territorial governor himself, transferred ownership of the original Hartwell homestead back to Clara Hartwell, along with all mineral rights and a formal apology from the territorial government for the injustices she had suffered. Clara sat at the same table where she'd once been too frightened to speak, now confidently reading through correspondence from lawyers in the territorial capital. The trials of Wade Morrison, Jake Morrison, and Cornelius Blake had concluded just 2 weeks earlier, with all 3 men sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The federal investigation had ultimately uncovered evidence of corruption involving more than 30 properties and at least 18 murdered families. "Listen to this," Clara said, holding up a letter from Marshal Hayes. "They found the third man, the young one I described. He was hiding in Denver, but he confessed everything once he realized Morrison and the others had already been convicted. His testimony helped them locate burial sites for some of the other families." Addie looked up from the garden planning she was doing for the coming spring. At 11 now, she had grown taller and more confident, but she still possessed the same determination that had driven her to spend $5 silver on independence. "That's good news. Those families deserve proper burials." "There's more," Clara continued. "The territorial government is offering compensation to any relatives of the murdered families, and they're establishing a fund to help other homesteaders who might have been targeted by similar schemes." Lorna smiled as she kneaded bread dough for the evening meal. At 64, she had found an unexpected purpose in helping to raise 2 girls who had taught her that family could be created through choice and loyalty rather than just blood. "Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished." Clara, justice for him and for all those other families. The past 6 months had transformed all of their lives in ways none of them could have predicted. Clara had chosen to rebuild her family's homestead, but not alone. Addie had decided to share the property, creating a unique arrangement where both girls could honor their separate histories while building a shared future. Samuel Hartwell had surprised everyone by proposing to move his blacksmith operation to the Hartwell property, where mineral surveying had revealed excellent iron ore deposits alongside the gold that had originally attracted Morrison's attention. The arrangement gave him purpose in his later years while providing the girls with a guardian who understood both the value of hard work and the importance of standing up for what was right. "Grandpa says the new forge should be ready by next month," Addie said, consulting her notes. "And Mrs. Henderson thinks we can get good prices for the vegetables we're planning to grow. Apparently people in town are eager to buy from us. They see it as a way to support what we did." Clara nodded, then grew thoughtful. "Sometimes I still can't believe it all happened. That we actually managed to expose Morrison, that justice was served, that we're all here planning a future together." "Believe it," Lorna said firmly. "You 3 didn't just stumble into justice. You fought for it. You made choices that could have cost you everything, and you made them because you knew the difference between what was safe and what was right." The afternoon was interrupted by a knock at the door. Lorna opened it to find a young man in his 20s, well-dressed and carrying official-looking documents. "Mrs. Brennan? I'm David Patterson from the Territorial Land Office. I was hoping to speak with Miss Clara Hartwell." Clara stood immediately wary. Too many men with official documents had brought tragedy to her life. "It's all right," the young man said quickly, noticing her reaction. "I'm here with good news. The territorial government has completed its investigation into the mineral rights on your property. You're now the official owner of what appears to be one of the richest gold deposits in the territory." He handed her a document that made Clara's eyes widen. The estimated value of the mineral rights on her family's land was enough to make her wealthy by any standard. Certainly enough to secure her future and the future of anyone she chose to share it with. "There's something else," Patterson continued. "The territorial governor would like to offer you a position as a junior consultant to the new Territorial Justice Commission. Your experience with corruption and your understanding of homestead law would be valuable in preventing future schemes like Morrison's." Clara looked at Addie and Lorna, seeing excitement and pride in their faces. She thought about her parents, about the other families who had died for the wealth that now legally belonged to her. Then she thought about the responsibility that came with both the money and the opportunity to serve justice. "I'll consider the position," she said carefully, "but I have conditions. First, a portion of any mineral profits goes to supporting other homesteading families. Second, Addie and I work together. Whatever I do in service of the territory, she's my partner." Addie felt tears spring to her eyes. After everything they'd been through together, Clara was still making sure they stayed together. "And third," Clara continued, "any work I do has to allow me to keep living here, on the land my father died for, with the people who've become my family." As evening settled over the property that had been bought with $5 and reclaimed through courage, 3 women sat on the porch of a house that had been built on the foundation of an old cabin. Clara wore her father's cross and carried her mother's Bible, but she also carried new dreams of justice and service. Addie had found the independence she'd sought, but discovered it was sweeter when shared with people who mattered. And Lorna had learned that the end of one life chapter could mark the beginning of another. Richer story. The $5 that had started it all sat in a place of honor on Clara's dresser. A reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of courage could change not just individual lives, but entire communities. What had begun as one orphaned girl's attempt to find a place to belong had become a story of justice, family, and the truth that real wealth came not from what you owned, but from what you were willing to sacrifice for others. In the distance, the sound of Samuel's hammer rang out from the new forge, steady and sure, the rhythm of honest work, of building something lasting, of a future forged from the courage to stand up for what was right.